I've played a lot of Void Knights, but none of them have been Autobombers, and none of them have been Spell Knights. When I set out to play my Smite Hammerton, originally, I was thinking of doing a Void Smite version, but Smite Knight just isn't as catchy as Hammerton, so that project went on the back burner. Then something kind of incredible happened. I got a Ravenous Void drop. One of the rarest and most powerful items in last Epoch. If you're coming here from Path of Exile, think of something like a Mage Blood. After getting it, I knew I had to play a build that truly did it justice. And maybe it was the perfect time to try that spell VK I had been thinking about for so long. After all, people said Devouring Orb Autobomber was dead. And okay, I guess if you're looking at a fully automatic build, this really isn't it. But if you're looking at something that has a pretty easy playstyle, maps pretty automatically until higher corruption, and has no trouble dealing with bosses, maybe you'll want to stick around for the semi-automatic Void Knight Abyssal Echoes build that I put together. To start off with, I'm going to talk about the key mechanics leveraged by the build. Then I'll get into things like skills, gear, blessings, and more, and finally wrap up with some thoughts and gameplay experience. So if you want to know how this build works, or you're not sure if it's for you, do be sure to stick around to the end. So first off, what are some of the key mechanics used by the Abyssal Echoes Void Knight build? I guess the first thing to explain is Abyssal Echoes itself, because it's a damage over time effect that absolutely doesn't function like a dot. When you hit an enemy with Abyssal Echoes, it applies Abyssal Decay. Abyssal Decay deals void damage over time with a base duration of 6 seconds. This can be increased through modifiers on your chess piece and idols. But here's where Abyssal Decay works very differently from other damage over time skills. When you hit an enemy affected with Abyssal Decay, you essentially pop the dot, dealing all of the damage immediately. It still counts as damage over time, but in a lot of ways functions more like a hit. So, to pop those dots frequently, we needed something that hits a lot. And for that, Devouring Orb is perfect, especially because you can spec it to rotate around your character and fire out Void Rifts, which give a level of passive reach for when you're fighting bosses that you just can't quite be in melee of. Though you can be in melee of a lot of bosses, since this build uses Bastion of Honor. Bastion of Honor says that you have a 100% block chance against enemies within 4 meters, which isn't very far away. Think super close hugging range, or melee as some people might call it. Because this 100% block chance only applies to really close enemies, having a little bit of block chance is still quite nice for dealing with ranged enemies. But you'll want to stack as much block effectiveness as you can get. If you're lucky enough to get LP, I'd absolutely try to get T7 block effectiveness on your Bastion of Honor. That said, you're probably not getting 1 LP, it's pretty darn rare. And then the last important mechanic is Anomaly. Now, there's technically 2 options to play here. You can either take Anomaly, or you can take Volatile Reversal. If you want to hit the most buttons possible, have to worry about positioning, and also timing, Volatile Reversal might give you better burst DPS, but in many cases that burst DPS will very quickly just be absorbed by boss DR anyway. So while Anomaly is on paper at least a little lower, in practice the DPS should be pretty comparable. And so that's what I went with, because it has a lot better quality of life. In fact, with Anomaly's cooldown being significantly lower than Reversal, and the fact that we deal almost pure void damage, you might end up doing more DPS with Anomaly rather than less, though that's debatable because then we're talking about snapshotting mana levels and all sorts of other things that are really easy to calculate on paper and really messy once you start playing the build for real. But with those key mechanics out of the way, let's get into the skills in a little bit more detail. Like I mentioned before, Abyssal Echo is the main skill of the build, or at the very least, the effect it inflicts Abyssal Decay. Unfortunately, there is no tooltip for Abyssal Echoes, so you're just going to have to guess at what the damage is. Don't worry, you can always go hit the dummy or a boss and you'll get decent numbers to pop up. Now when it comes to Abyssal Echo specialization, there's honestly not that many points to play with. To start with, you always want to go over to Shrieking Echoes. This gives you 2 additional casts to counteract the downside of Vorpal Explosion. 80% more damage is a powerful modifier, but not having it chain makes it honestly quite awkward. Luckily though, Screaming Rifts casts Abyssal Echo multiple times, 3 to be exact, and this is extended up to 5 with Shrieking Echoes. So you get a lot of casts that you can instantly proc time after time on single target. Now, to make up for the clear a little bit, I went with Spreading Chaos and Overwhelming Doom, though these points are honestly quite flexible and could be put elsewhere into a build, such as Embrace the Darkness, or if you're using Volatile Reversal, then something like Time Compression. I also happened to grab Myopia, but it's definitely not necessary. A little bit of blind chance on your tree or your weapon is more than enough. I just liked it for a 100% uptime on Embrace the Darkness, plus just not having to worry about certain ranged projectiles, because blind enemies aren't very good at aiming. Now, beyond Vorpal Explosion, most of your damage comes from Vorpal Reverberation for plus 50 flat spell void damage. This is base damage, which makes it highly valuable, and can be combined with Turbulence for 75% Abyssal Decay duration. You can think of Abyssal Decay duration as a separate modifier, kind of like how Crit Multi works for crit builds. Now, Abyssal Echoes wouldn't be doing all that much damage without these, the Devouring Orbs. You need something to hit an enemy, thus proccing your Abyssal Decay. Otherwise, it's kind of a sad dot instead of a massive chunk of damage. Now, something to keep in mind with Devouring Orb, while it is purely spec'd out for utility here, it's also pretty good at clearing trash, so most small enemies will die to the hits. Keeping that in mind, going for Dark Moon is very important. This way, Devouring Orb orbits you, which means that it's no longer stuck in a place that you don't want it. But to have a little bit more reach, we do take Abyssal Emission with Chaotic Torrent. In theory, if you wanted, you could go Cataclysm as well, but I don't think that's worth it, because the damage honestly is pretty mediocre, and cutting the duration by another 40% just feels rough. To round things out, I do very much recommend Sightless Star for the 150% mana efficiency. If you need a little help on your clear, don't take Abyssal Juggernaut and instead grab Extinction. 40% more damage on the collision definitely melts trash a lot faster, and as I push higher into Corruption, I'll definitely be using Extinction more and more. Like I mentioned before, Anomaly is the main utility skill. It's this really fun time safety bubble. For Anomaly, there's a bunch of nodes that I think you can't spare, and a bunch that are honestly up to you. The ones that you can't spare are Mark of Rot. It's a 5-second duration, 100% void damage taken increase, which, at my current cooldown recovery, is a 50% uptime, which effectively is 50% more void damage dealt. I also came over here, where I leave behind a time bubble, slowing enemies and shredding their void resistance. Slow's quite nice, and shredding void resistance is a lot more reliable here, rather than having to hit enemies with Devouring Orb to wait for it to ramp up. From there, I grabbed Swift Rest, which gives me 30% global cooldown recovery speed while I'm in the time bubble area. But this isn't the only way you could build it. Instead, you could drop all of these nodes here and go over grab 2 points in Emission, then 3 points in Anticipation. That way, Anomaly will have a shorter cooldown, up to 3 seconds shorter, which gives you almost 100% uptime on Mark of Rot. I honestly don't know which of these two felt better. The cooldown is technically very slightly shorter with Anticipation, but the global cooldown recovery speed means that you get to cast more Abyssal Echoes and Devouring Orbs. I guess it ultimately comes down to how much you have to move while your bubble is down. Because, in theory, because Swift Rest does also apply to the Anomaly itself, thus lowering its cooldown from 9.6 down to 7.7 seconds, meaning it's almost on par with Anticipation. Plus, it saves you a point. Then for the rest of my points, I grabbed Immediacy, plus Time Lock, and Temporal Prison. I was also experimenting with Stasis, but to be honest, I think it's totally fine to drop this point while still using Anomaly. Now, for my last two skills, it's much more utility. Shield Rush is a great movement skill. Grab Rush Mastery for the mana efficiency, protective speed, and click anywhere else you want. The rest of your points really don't matter that much. For Sigils of Hope, I went with a Void version. Sure, I don't get the healing, but I do get 15% increased Void damage per active Sigil. And from there, I mostly just spec'd into the general utility tree that you see on a lot of Sigil of Hope builds. The only thing that's a little bit unusual is going down to Quiet Mind for mana efficiency. This was so I could spam them just a little bit more on boss fights, as the build is quite mana intensive. Though feel free to drop this and instead grab a little bit of damage or a little bit of duration. When it comes to passives, the name of the game was balancing defense and offense. As a result, I took a lot of the defensive options, though if you're not in higher corruption, let's say you're below 300, you might want to go for more damage. That said, do keep in mind that Vitality is not only health, but also DPS, so you should always take it. Over in Forge Guard, I took Battle Hardened for extra armor and physical resistance when hit. The Phys Res doesn't really matter here, it's just the increased armor I wanted. Plus Steel Aegis for block effectiveness, and more importantly, Rallying Block for up to 150 flat armor. If you wanted more damage, these would be the points that you drop. It would be quite easy to put these in the VK tree or the Paladin tree. In terms of Paladin, I went with Armor, again for block effectiveness, Valor for health, and Heavenfire for plus 30 spell damage with a shield. This is a great way to add a ton of DPS to your build, though if you want other defenses, Defiance is great for elemental resistance. If you need necrotic res, go for Holy Icon, and if you need damage, let's come over to the VK tree. I started off by grabbing all of the void damage I could, then I scaled into defensive increases such as Abyssal Endurance, and of course World Eater, since this is a great amount of leech. I grabbed 1 point in Future Strike, not because I think it's that effective, but as a 1 point wonder, I applied a bit of a time, and hey, it's 60 void damage, which scales off of damage over time. Then Renouncement, it's got Vitality. It makes Smite scale off of Vitality, and if I was using Smite, that would be great. I was actually using Smite as a teleport skill for a bit, but that just seemed overly complicated and not that effective, unfortunately. I grabbed Echoing Strike for the Echo Chance. For a while I was using Time Legion, but it honestly didn't seem that good, so I grabbed Dread for the movement speed. I do think Time Legion might be a little bit more damage, but movement speed feels good, and I want it to go fast. Then, to make sure I have all the defenses I need, Eternal Form into Void Aegis, and Essence of the End into Void Well. Finally, Avatar of Regret is great for 10% Echo Chance. The mana cost penalty is a little bit annoying, but absolutely manageable, and Void Flex is great to have a cheat death. Now, if you wanted to scale into more damage, you could easily grab things like Time Legion, fully fill out Dread, or of course, Sorrow and Steel. Now when it comes to gear, let's start with important blessings. First off, Grand Depths of Infinity. 50% chance to shred Void Res on hit. While not absolutely mandatory due to Anomaly, it's quite nice to have this as your Void Shred ramps up faster, and the faster you can ramp Void Shred, the faster you can start doing your full damage to enemies. Moving on, I'm using Grand Bastion of Divinity. You'll have to fight Lagan a couple times, but it's a really easy way to cap Lightning Res, and you don't really scale off of any of the other bonuses he offers. Grand Survival of Might, pretty standard across most builds. Getting Crit Strike Avoidance here means that you don't need it on 2 pieces of gear. And for the last 2 important ones, Grand Bulwark of a Tundra, 67% increased armor. More armor is more tankiness, and you definitely want more tankiness. Plus, Grand Body of Obsidian, for, you guessed it, 268 armor, even more tankiness. Now, if you want to know more about blessings, and how to pick the right blessings for any build, sometime within the next few days, I'm going to be releasing a Last Epoch blessing guide. Be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that upload. Now on the other hand, let's take a look at my gear. For my idols, I'm stacking as much Abyssal Decay duration as I can, with other things I'm prioritizing being mana efficiency with void spells, armor, and vitality. You don't have to use things that perfectly match what I'm using. Time Rot is quite nice for a little bit of extra damage since you're all about void damage over time. And in some cases, especially if you spec into more damage, you might want something like Skill Echo damage. However, because I didn't have a ton of Echo nodes, this felt like the better option. Coming over to my items, I of course have a Ravenous Void. No LP, this is an item that makes you super tanky. Just be sure that you have a Cleanse on your belt. Otherwise, once you get afflicted with Mimic Feast, it's kind of all over, because you will stop leeching and you will die. I've also got a Bastion of Honor to give me 100% block chance, which means I want to be in melee range whenever physically possible. For my weapon, I'm using Damage Over Time Spell Damage Hybrid with Chill on Hit as a suffix. Overall, it's a pretty mediocre scepter, but it does everything that I want. I strongly advise either a scepter with the hybrid spell damage spell mana cost, or a wand with minus mana cost as an implicit, and 2 damage mods such as increased damage over time and increased void damage. I think ultimately the wand is probably slightly higher DPS, but this is pretty darn close. We're talking 20 or 30% increased damage, and when I have hundreds, close to 1,000 increased damage, that's not that big of a deal. On my rings, I really wanted to focus on getting defensive stats. That's why I have crit strike avoidance and elemental resistance instead of just more life. My other ring is much the same, though in that case the cold res is superfluous, so I should probably swap that to something a little bit better. This ring is my oldest piece of gear and really something I should have replaced a long time ago. My belt is also fairly old and also something I should probably replace. Mana regen is really good. Void damage is good. Cleanse is super important. Ideally for the suffixes, I'd want cold res and cooldown recovery, since that would be a significant damage boost, at least provided that I had the mana recovery to sustain it. The best way to get that mana recovery would be use something like an exalted mana regen belt and use the cleanse as the sealed mod. For my boots, I went with vitality since that scales my damage plus gives me life. Movement speed, since that, well, makes me move faster. Cooldown recovery speed is a must, and fire res because beggars can't be choosers. That should honestly be a hybrid life instead. I could give a fire res in several other places, like this ring. That cold res just doesn't need to be there. Do try to get a sealed tainted effigy, that way you get the flat spell void damage. Increased void damage is good, damage over time is good. Poison res, endurance, and the increased cold damage was just to seal away a bad mod. Though ideally instead I'd want something like frailty chance as a sealed suffix. On your chest piece, aim for increased abyssal decay duration. Remember, this is effectively a multiplier to your damage. I also suggest getting a Solarum plate, because having both endurance and fairly high armor built into your chest is absolutely incredible. For the other stats, vitality is a good prefix, and the suffixes should be whatever you're missing. Helmet, kind of the same. Vitality is a prefix, try to get a good armor base or an armor cooldown recovery base. Increased void damage, spell void damage is quite good. I happened to get a health roll, and necrotic res was something I was missing. Those suffixes really could be anything though. My amulet is another piece that's quite old. Ideally I want void penetration as a prefix, void damage or spell damage as the other prefix, health, and again, any suffix I'm missing. Overall, my gear isn't that perfect, but it doesn't need to be. The build's strong enough that I'm easily able to take on bosses while clearing at 300 plus corruption. If you want to see more of the content this build was able to take on, do be sure to stick around. But I know I just spent quite a while talking about stats, numbers, and items. If you want a planner to reference, then you can always use the link that's on screen right now, or join my Discord, a link will be down in the description. React to give yourself both the community and notification roles so you can see all the channels, and then head over to the build link archive where you'll also find a link to the planner. The planner will have not only my current gear as it stands, but a little bit more of a best in slot set. This way, it's also a lot easier to update and keep up to date if I ever need to. When I went into this build, I didn't have too many expectations for it. In fact, I was pretty skeptical as to whether it would be good at all. And in that regard, it's definitely exceeded my expectations. It took me a little bit to get from the start of Empowered Monos all the way up to 300 Corruption. But ever since getting there, it's been really smooth sailing. I've pushed a bunch of other Monos up to 300, pushed one well past that, fought a whole bunch of different bosses around 250 to 350 Corruption with no real issues. Sure, if I stood in a big slam, I'd definitely be punished for it if a boss had damage mods. But I could give a boss really scary damage mods and avoid their big hits without issue. Or I could give them defensive mods and kill them while standing in almost everything they did. When it comes to dungeons, I haven't done that many to be honest, but I did do a few T4 Lightless Arbors, got nothing good, one T4 Soulfire Bastion, and got nothing good, and a couple of T4 Julras, which went about as smoothly as I could expect given that the skill is currently slightly bugged. If you fight Julra, do be careful. Temporal Shift has the Void tag. Void spell skills echo on Void Knights, which means you might get shifted right back into the big old Meteor Slam. So shift early and plan accordingly. It's pretty frustrating when it happens, but if you plan carefully, it's not going to ruin your run, at least any Morven all the damage over time already does. And being able to function as either a melee build or a pseudo-ranged caster is really effective on fights like Julra. When clearing, my general playstyle is to just put up Devouring Orb and then run through stuff. Anything that isn't tanky will die almost immediately just to the damage done by Devouring Orb. Things that are tankier hold on for a little bit, and I have to drop Abyssal Echoes on them, maybe even Anomaly them for good measure, but that takes care of things really quickly. This build also feels super safe when clearing a lot of more dangerous content. Want to take on a Diamond Matron? Just time lock her. When she's frozen, you can kill her before she gets to do anything else. Want to take on a boss? Just time lock it. You can kill it before it unfreezes. Or at least you can kill some of them before they unfreeze. You're definitely not going to be killing Rye before he unfreezes, though a few times that has completely broken his AI, and he'll stand still for the entire rest of a fight without trying to fight back or kill me. Don't count on that bug, by the way. There's a very good chance it's going to be patched out in the future, as it absolutely should be. So maybe it's because I went into this build with low expectations. Maybe it's because I had some awesome items. Or maybe it's just because the build's good. But it's been awesome. And I know you might be saying, but 10, I don't have Ravenous Void. What am I going to wear on my hands? Also, how are your hands not being consumed by those mimics? First of all, they are. This entire process was incredibly painful. Second of all, go farm Rye, get Atrophy Gloves, very fairly common drop, and it's really easy to get them with LP. What this will do is give you a great offensive item for damage over time builds. Something like this pair would be absolutely perfect. So that's my Abyssal Echoes Devouring Orb Semi-Automatic Void Knight. And now I'm curious, and when you go into a build, what do you value? Do you want something that's so tanky you can get up and grab a drink, then come back to a character that's still alive? Do you want so much damage that you trigger boss DR and then do almost no damage because you triggered boss DR? Do you want the fastest build? Or do you just want something that feels really good to play? Leave some of those thoughts down in the comments below. And while you're down there, if you got to this point in the video, be sure to leave a like. Now before I go, I want to give a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link down in the description. If you want something else to watch, then maybe check out some of my other Last Epoch content. I have a variety of guides focused on helping you learn the basics of the game, plus a few other builds that I've had success with. Or you can always go for a recommendation that's on screen right now. But that's it for me today. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.